Yeah, good day, guys. And today's lesson will based on the 13 most frequently drawn questions in physics. And I believe these topics, if students go through these topics, you will be definitely be on the safe side to have a very good grade in physics. I bet you. Now we have there are 13 most repeated questions in physics. Now, this theory part is divided into three parts. You have part one, and part one, you come across 7 questions, and these 7 questions you'll be asked to only go in for 5. And each of those questions is 3 marks, and 3 by 5 will give you 15 marks. So part one, you're entitled to have a maximum marks of 15. While part two, you'll be given 5 questions, and those 5 questions you'll be asked to go in for 3 questions, and each question is 15 marks. So those 3 questions, if you attempt those 3 questions, you'll be eligible to have a maximum marks of 45. That's for part 2. And part 3, you come across 50 set questions, which we normally call as simply the objectives. So you'll be asked to attempt all of those 50 questions. So now, what are the 13 most repeated questions in physics? This is going for WASSCE, NECO, and JAMB. Now, for the first part, which is part 1, we have the 7 harmonized topics for WASSCE, NECO, and as well as JAMB. And I bet you any student that go through these topics, that student is assured of having a very good grade in physics, not less than B. You see. Now, the first topic is dimensional analysis. For the past years, there are always questions drawn under this topic, and so students, before you go into the hall to take your paper, you must be able to analyze dimensional analysis. And some of the subtopics you must be able to try to target there. You have to target the definition of like dimensional analysis. And the second point again, you should be able to take note of again the application and the limitation of dimensional analysis. Also, there are other cases again, you have to take note of the uses of dimensions, and you should be able to recognize the physical quantities used in dimensional analysis. And you will also come across with basic or simple calculations under there. So dimensional analysis is one of the harmonized topics, so it must thoroughly be mastered. And the second topic again, which is part of the 7 most drawn questions for the first part, which is part 1, is physical quantities and units. So you should be able to master your physical quantities and units. You should be able to know the definition of physical quantities. You should be able to know the types of physical quantities, and as well as you should be able to know the definition of units and the types of units. So this is the second type. We'll move again to the third type of question. We consider the properties of material. The properties of material, you have to know the definition. You have to consider elasticity. You have to consider the term used in elasticity, and you have to consider again the graph of strainable material, wherein you have to consider the like the load extension graph. All of those graphs should be considered. There is also another law which should be taken into consideration, which is the Hooke's law. This also should be taken into consideration. There are another similar terms again. You have to also take note of tensile strain, tensile stress, and as well as Young's modulus. And what you have to take note under this topic, you'll be say basic calculations or simple calculations regarding to stress strain. So all of this must be mastered if you want to have your very good grade in physics. So the other topics again under the harmonized topics, and we also have the next part. You also need to consider the wave-particle paradox. This again another frequent drawn topic. You see, wave-particle paradox. You have to consider electron diffraction. You have to consider the duality of matter you also need to consider, like, there's this badge of certainty principle. So if we move again forward, we also consider fibers and lasers. Fibers and lasers, again, this again, for the past 6 to 7 years, this is a topic wherein questions are always coming on the first part. You see, so you should be able to recognize, like, the explanation of concepts in terms of fiber optics, and that as well goes in again for lasers. You should be able to know the uses that relate between fibers and lasers. So this again, another frequent topic. So another frequent topic again normally drawn is gravitational field. You see, you have to consider the concept of fields. You also need to consider again acceleration due to gravity, G. You also have to know the gravitational force, like, between two masses, wherein you consider the Newton's laws of gravitation, wherein, yeah, you also need to consider the gravitational potential and simply the escape velocity. Another term again we need to also consider, or quantity we also need to consider under gravitational field. You also need to consider satellites and rockets. Under satellites and rockets, what is most important there, you have to take note of the uses of both rockets and as well as satellites. You see. And the last topic for part 1, motion under gravity, wherein you have to deal with your projection, motion. You see, you have to do basic calculations. You see, you have to consider basic book calculations under time of flight, maximum height. You may be asked to find your range, or you may be asked to find your maximum range. So all of these are things you have to consider under motion under gravity. So from the first topic I have mentioned onto this 7th topic, these are frequently drawn topics or topics under part 1. So if you take your time and you go through these topics, you understand them to your fingertips, I bet you'll be able to have your A in physics for both WASSCE, JAMB, and NECO. So let's see again for the part 2, the theory part. If we move to the part 2, again, we have 6 basic questions we need to take note of. For part 2 again, we have the 6 most repeated book questions. We'll consider the 6 most repeated questions. The first one, we have the linear and dynamic motion. Linear and dynamic motion must be considered. So if we consider under linear motion, the first quantity we need to consider, you have to consider speed. Yeah, and as well as, again, also we consider velocity. So you have to know the definitions for both speed and velocity. It's another part of linear motion, and also the relationship again, or the difference between uniform and non-uniform speed or velocity. You see, you also need to take note of the types of the graphs, the distance or displacement time graphs. This also must be considered. Another topic again, we also need to take note of the concept, the concept of retardation or deceleration. This should be also considered. We also need to take note of uniform and non-uniform acceleration. And the next point, velocity time graph. And the last part for under linear motion is simply the equations of motion with constant acceleration. So these are topics normally drawn on in part 2. So it must be considered. Mostly this topic and linear and dynamic is mostly the question 8 under the theory part. And if we consider again the dynamic motion, some of the topics you must be considered, or you must take into consideration under dynamic motion, we need to take note of first laws, Newton's first laws of motion. You have to know the first law, the second law, the third law, and as well as again the applications. You will come across basic calculations regarding to Newton's first law, second law, and third law. You should also be able to take note of collisions and the types of collisions. You may be asked to differentiate between perfect elastic collision and perfect inelastic collision. So these are things you should be able to take note of. So if we move again to the next topic, normally frequently run under part 2, we have the heat, temperature, and gases. These are broad topics. But I just summarize them in simple way. Like for heat, temperature, and gases, some of the topics you have to take into consideration, like temperature and heat measurements. These are things you should be able to take into consideration, and you'll be having basic calculations under temperature and heat measurement. Also, heat and heat transfer. This again, another subtopic you need to consider, and heat transfer, heat capacity, and some basic topics under gases. So all of this must well be considered. Now, the next topic is concepts of wave motion. This is another frequent topic. If you go through the past questions, there will be no year where you not see questions drawn under wave motion. Some of the things you should be considered or taken into consideration will be propagation of mechanical waves. You should be also able to take note of the difference between transverse waves and longitudinal waves, because there is a basic way to differentiate transverse wave and longitudinal waves, because transverse waves, they travels perpendicular to the direction of vibration of the medium, while the longitudinal waves, they travel parallel to the direction of vibration of the medium. So this again must be considered. We also need to take note of the properties of waves. We have various properties of waves, so all of this must be considered. Like one of the properties of waves, we have reflection, you see, we have diffraction, like we have again interference, we have polarization. So all of these, we have refraction, diffraction. So all of these are basic properties of wave motion. So you must be able to consider them. Another part again should also be considered under wave motion. Should be able to know like the wave, the wave equations, because you will come across basic calculations that involve wave equations. So you should be able to know the formulas you'll be using to calculate wave equations. And the next topic, which is the 11th topic for this session, will be capacitors and alternating currents. This again, another frequent topic normally drawn on. In part 2, capacitors, you should be able, before you go in for your exam, should be able, make sure you understand capacitors thoroughly, and as well as the alternating currents. And the next topic again is, should be able to take note of light. You see, there are many subtopics on light, sources of light, you see, the dispersion. You see, there are various topics you should be able to underline or take into consideration under light. And the last topic for this session would be nuclear physics and atomic physics. So if these areas are considered, definitely be assured of having a very good grade in physics. Don't forget, take note of this. Physics divided into 3 parts, part 1, part 2, and part 3. You see, just after that, you also have the practical part. But the practical part, you only have 4 topics which are mostly drawn. So from those 4 topics, they will select three topics for the practical. But from those 3 topics, there are always 2 areas which are always constant. Like for the 4 areas normally drawn for the physics practical will be mechanics, and the second part again electricity, the next part light, and the other part again wave motions or heat. So those are the areas normally drawn. But the 2 most constant areas for the practical will be electricity and mechanics. These are always coming since starting of WASSCE and on to 2023. You always have questions under electricity and mechanics for practical. So this must be taken into consideration. So this is the end of the video. Thank you and stay blessed.